Picture this. It's 1,716 deep into the night. You're dangling from a rope 100 feet above the freezing Atlantic Ocean. One slip of the hand, one gust of wind, and you're shark food. Your hands stopped feeling like hands a long time ago. They're just a mess of blisters. Old ones still healing, new ones already torn open by ropes soaked in salt water, stiff as steel wire. You might think sounds like some extreme sport, right? No, this is just your Tuesday. You're a merchant sailor. You thought you were chasing the open sea and adventure. Turns out, you walked straight into a floating hell. You're barely in your 20s. Should be the wildest years of your life. Instead, every muscle in your back and shoulders is screaming. You didn't wake up to follow your dreams. You were dragged out of your hammock by the boatswain's whistle, sharp as a blade. And the pay? Brother, wake up. Don't even go there. On merchant ships back then, whether you got paid at all depended entirely on the captain's mood. Your wages weren't settled until the voyage was completely over. If the ship sank halfway, or you died of disease, your entire year of back-breaking work counted for nothing. Your family got zero, and if you were lucky enough to survive and make it back to port, that captain who ruled the ship like an absolute king had 100 ways to dock your pay. Tools left in the wrong place? Deducted. Captain thinks you looked lazy? Deducted. Deducted. A whole year of misery, and what you took home might barely cover a few drinks. Then, just to avoid starving, you'd sign another contract and do it all over again. Now, you might think at least the food's decent, right? Wrong. The food would make you question your will to live. Your daily meal was something called hardtack. Sounds almost classy. In reality, it's a slab of flour and salt baked into a brick hard enough to crack your teeth. To eat it, you had to soak it in foul water or sour beer first. And the worst part? It was always crawling with tiny black weevils. The meat, salt pork, cured for months, sometimes years. So salty it turned bitter. You had to rinse it for hours before it was barely edible. As for water stored in wooden barrels until it turned green and grew a fuzzy coat, one sip and the taste would haunt you forever. Eat like that long enough and your body starts falling apart. Your gums bleed, your teeth loosen and fall out one by one. Old wounds mysteriously reopen. That's scurvy, the #1 killer of sailors in that era. But the worst part wasn't the disease. It was the people. The merchant captain was a tyrant. That 9-tailed whip of his could land on your back at any moment. If he didn't like the look on your face, or you climbed the mast a second too slow, those barbed ends would flay you open. No trial, no appeal. His word was the law. You stare out at the horizon and think, is this really it for me? Just labour, hunger, and lashings until the sea swallows me whole? That's when rumours about pirates start whispering in your ear. Were they really the enemies of mankind, like the newspapers said? Or had they found a different way to live? And then a black dot appears on the horizon. It grows larger, fast, impossibly fast. A flag ripples from the mast black as night, like nothing you've ever seen before. Your heart starts pounding, not from fear, from something worse, something you're almost afraid to name. Hope. While you're still staring, that dark ship has already glided up beside you like a ghost, smaller than your heavy merchant vessel, lighter. But on the open water, it moved like it had a rocket engine, agile in a way that made your skin crawl. A puff of white smoke erupts from its side. Then, boom! A cannonball skims across your bow. That's the universal language of the sea. Stop, or the next one takes you all down with it. Your captain, the man who strutted around this ship like a king, has gone white as a freshly painted wall. He knows those rusted little cannons of his are toys compared to what's out there. Resistance just means everyone dies faster. So he gives the order that makes your heart lurch and, somehow, your pulse quicken with something like anticipation. Lower the flag. Surrender. The two ships pull alongside each other. Grappling hooks bite into your railing like iron claws. As the pirates pour onto the deck, you brace yourself for chaos, snarling madmen, blades swinging. But what you see makes your jaw drop. They're calm, organised, almost, cool about it. These men have the same calloused hands, the same sun-darkened skin. They're sailors, just like you, but the look in their eyes that belongs to men who answer to nobody. Pistols at the hip, cutlasses in hand, and an ease about them that only free men carry. They disarm the officers quickly, then herd the rest of you, the regular sailors, to the center of the deck. Just as you're bracing for the worst, a man steps forward, not the captain, the quartermaster. He speaks plainly. He looks at you and says, "Brothers, we're not here for your lives. We're here for the cargo, so here's your choice." End quote. Stay with this captain who's been bleeding you dry and living like dogs, or join us and split the gold. As he says it, you notice the older sailors beside you swallowing hard. Pirates never forced anyone to join. They didn't want resentful prisoners. They wanted willing brothers. You look back at that barrel of bug-infested hardtack. You think about the pay that'll probably get docked to nothing when you reach port. Then you look at the cup being held out to you, a mug of grog, warm and rum-scented. That's the smell of freedom. Something inside you snaps. You and two other sailors exchange a glance. You take a breath, and you step forward. The quartermaster grins and presses the cup into your hand. Welcome to the outlaw life, brother. The moment you cross that railing and set foot on the pirate ship's deck, your old name, your humiliating contract, and your doomed future, all of it gets left behind. You think you just joined a gang of criminals. But what you're about to discover is that you've actually joined the most advanced democratic experiment of the entire era. The grog hits your stomach, and you think, all right, this is just one big lawless party, isn't it? But this ship is about to teach you something. Freedom doesn't mean chaos, and outlaws have their own code. The quartermaster leads you to a corner of the deck. He unfolds a piece of worn parchment, its edges soft from years of handling. His expression turns serious. "Brother," he says, "now that you're in the family, you sign here. This is the legendary pirate code. You might think that's just something they made up for the movies, but it was real. And in its time, it was the most rational and fair system on the water. Almost everywhere in the world, the king made the rules. Laws existed to keep poor people in line. But on a pirate ship, the rules were voted on. One man, one vote. This level of democracy was centuries ahead of its time. You weren't signing a contract of servitude. You were signing the charter of a floating republic." The quartermaster clears his throat and reads you the key articles. Listen up. Every single one of these is going to blow your mind. Article 1. Everyone gets a vote. Whether it's choosing where to sail or deciding how to punish someone who caused trouble, everyone votes. Even the captain is elected. If he fails to find prey or shows cowardice in battle, the crew can vote him out on the spot. Have you ever seen a merchant sailor remove a captain? Here, you're a shareholder. Article 2. Fair distribution of plunder. No fixed wages here. No hunt, no pay, simple as that. Sound harsh? Here's what matters when there is a haul. The split is written into the code. The captain takes 2 shares. The quartermaster gets 1.5. You, as a regular sailor, take 1 full share. No negotiation, no tricks. No captain finding excuses to dock your earnings. Article 3. Compensation for the injured. This one is genuinely moving. The code states that if you're wounded in battle fighting for your brothers, the ship pays you. Lose your right arm, 600 silver coins. Lose a leg, 500. Lose an eye, 100. This money comes out of the common fund before anyone else gets their cut. On this ship, you are not disposable. You are a brother. Article 4. Strict discipline lights out at 8. Not because anyone cares about your beauty sleep. It's because this wooden ship is packed with gunpowder and rope. One spark, and everyone goes to meet their maker. Gambling and brawling aboard the ship are also strictly forbidden. Got a grievance? Wait until you're ashore. Pistols or cutlasses, settle it fair and open. But on this ship, anyone who raises a hand against a brother becomes the enemy of all. You take the quill, your hand trembling slightly not from fear, but from a sense of solidity you've never felt before. You make your mark. With that one stroke, you leave the old world behind and step into a community built on fairness by outlaws, for outlaws. But rules or not, you still need to eat. You still need to work. And you're about to discover that in this floating utopia, every morning brings 2 things with it: the smell of freedom and a stench unlike anything you've ever encountered. The one and only fragrance of life aboard a pirate ship. Contract signed. Drink downed. You're now officially a co-owner of this vessel. You look around your new home with fresh eyes. And honestly, it might not even clear the bar of your old pig pen back home. This is a sloop built for speed above all else. Every inch of spare space has been surrendered to cannons and ammunition. You climb down through the hatch into the lower deck. A wall of heat hits you, along with an eye-watering smell you are absolutely not prepared for. Dozens of men who haven't bathed, sour rum, and rising up from the bilge below, a thick, festering soup of seawater, waste, and everything else you don't want to imagine. It's like a punch to the face, every hour, around the clock. A constant reminder, freedom has a price. No private rooms here, no proper bed. Your bedroom is a hammock slung from the beams. Don't underestimate that scrap of canvas, though. It's genuine survival technology. On a merchant ship, you'd sleep on the hard deck, every roll of the waves could send you flying. A hammock moves with the ship. It keeps you from waking up face first on the planking. You curl up in that narrow strip of fabric, your crewmates snoring, rattling right next to your ear, with absolutely zero privacy. You might ask, if the living conditions are this bad, why be a pirate? Because pirates control their own time. Merchant ships had to stick to their routes, deliver their cargo on schedule, keep the bosses happy. Pirates didn't. When the crew got sick of the weevil-infested hardtack, the captain would simply order a stop at an uninhabited island. There, you weren't slaves grinding through a schedule. You were hunters. Guns and blades in hand, heading into the jungle. Picture it, a fire on the beach, a freshly caught wild boar roasting over the flames, fat sizzling and spitting, actual food, real flavour. And on a lucky day, you'd catch a giant sea turtle. That thing was basically a living tin can. Flip it on its back on the deck and it stays alive for weeks. One turtle feeds the whole ship, and the meat is genuinely delicious. The freedom to just stop and hunt when you're hungry to the Royal Navy, that was madness. To you, it was dignity. Of course, the best days came after a successful score. When you'd emptied a merchant captain's private store's fine French wine, spices, soft white flour, the whole ship turned into an instant celebration. Brandy swiped from the hull, fresh baked bread, loud, filthy sea shanties echoing across the water. In that moment, with gold in your hand and warmth in your belly, every whiff of that bilge stench felt completely worth it. But don't let the party fool you. Between the feasts, there were endless stretches of grinding routine. Without a sharp mind keeping this crew in line, the ship would tear itself apart within days. Which brings us to the real power structure beneath that code. Who actually runs things on this ship? On a vessel packed with testosterone and men who all carry pistols, you might assume the biggest, toughest guy calls the shots. Run things that way, and the crew splinters in 3 days flat. Pirates operated on something far more sophisticated, a dual leadership system, specifically designed to prevent the kind of tyranny you escaped from on the merchant ship. First, let's talk about the captain. Here, the captain isn't inherited, and he isn't appointed by some owner back on shore. He's elected, voted in by the crew because he's genuinely the best, usually the finest navigator aboard. Someone who can read the sea and the stars. But the captain's authority has an expiration date. Only when a target appears on the horizon and the ship goes into combat mode does the captain become an absolute commander. In those moments, his word is law. Hesitate for a second, and you're gambling with everyone's life. That total authority exists purely for efficiency. There's no time to hold a vote in the middle of a firefight, but the moment the smoke clears and the battle ends, that authority vanishes. He can't randomly whip you. He can't hoard the good rum for himself. He can't even take a larger cabin without the crew's consent. Miss a few hunts in a row, or flinch in battle, the crew votes him out. Simple as that. So who runs things day to day? That brings us to the quartermaster, the real father figure to every ordinary sailor on this ship. If the captain is the commander who handles battle, the quartermaster is the administrator who handles life, and the judge who handles disputes. Also elected, representing the interests of the crew. He controls distribution every meal, every ration of rum, divided fairly and publicly. He mediates conflict. Brothers argue over cards or feel cheated on a split. The quartermaster rules, and everyone accepts it. He enforces discipline, and importantly, it is never the captain who orders punishment. That's the quartermaster's job. That's called separation of powers. No room for personal vendettas. And He guards the plunder. Every coin, every bolt of silk, every barrel of rum stays in his custody until it's time to divide the spoils. Nobody takes a penny more than their share. The logic is elegant. Combat authority goes to the most capable fighter. The welfare and justice of daily life goes to the most trusted voice of the crew. They balance each other. Neither can become a king. This isn't a pirate ship. This is a floating democratic republic of the people, by the people, for the people. Though under all this high-minded democracy, life still has its ugly moments. If you slip on the rigging or take a bullet in a firefight, the person you most need to see is not the captain. It's the man with the saw. The worst thing that can happen to you on a pirate ship isn't running into the Royal Navy. It's getting sick. Or getting hurt. Because out here, going to the doctor is about to give you a whole new definition of the word terrifying. Real doctors were rarer than gold coins in that era. If you got incredibly lucky and captured a ship that happened to have one aboard, that man became the single most treasured person on the vessel. Well fed, well treated, practically begged to join the crew. Because his brain and his hands meant the difference between life and death for everyone. But in reality, most pirate ships had no formally trained surgeon anywhere on board. So the question is, if you catch a bullet in the leg, or a pulley block smashes your arm, who saves you? Usually the carpenter. I'm not joking, completely serious. The carpenter was the man most skilled, with a saw and a chisel. Steady hands, a strong stomach, deep professional experience cutting through hard material. The reasoning was practical. If the carpenter can cleanly saw off a rotting plank, he can saw off a gangrenous leg. When they carried you to the improvised surgery table on the main deck, the instruments waiting for you were the carpenter's usual tools: a bone saw, a sharp knife, forceps for pulling out musket balls. Anesthesia? Not a chance. General anesthesia meant downing an entire bottle of hard rum, maybe chewing a bit of opium. Then someone shoved a leather strap between your teeth to stop you biting through your own tongue. Then came the main event: amputation. To prevent gangrene, which meant certain death, the carpenter doctor would remove the bone with maximum speed. To stop the bleeding, he would press a red-hot iron block directly onto the wound, or pour boiling tar onto the stump. And the smell of scorched flesh and the sounds that came with it, those were the real soundtrack of a pirate ship after every battle. If you were merely dealing with something minor, fever, dysentery, you were at the mercy of your immune system. Cramped, filthy quarters were a paradise for bacteria. The bilge below was in a constant battle with your body. Sounds like being a pirate was just one long gamble with death? It was. But remember that code. If you were genuinely disabled in battle, your brothers would not throw you overboard like trash. That injury compensation clause existed for exactly that reason. Even if you spent the rest of your days hobbling along some dockside with a cane, that payout kept you living with dignity. That bond between crewmates knowing no one would be abandoned was what gave men the nerve to charge into enemy fire when their only surgeon was a carpenter with a saw. Still, we much preferred finding ways to win without anyone needing surgery at all, which is where the pirates' greatest weapon came in. Not the cannons, not the cutlasses. The flag. Brother, what do you think a pirate's most powerful weapon was? The cannons? The blades? Neither. The real masters of this trade were students of psychology. Piracy is a business. Fighting costs money. Cannonballs, ship repairs, injury payouts from the common fund, it all adds up. The most profitable raid is the one where you don't fire a single shot and the other ship hands over everything anyway. The tool that made that possible? The Jolly Roger flying from the top of the mast. You've seen skull and crossbones flags in movies, thought it was just for style. But to a sailor in the 18th century, that flag was a death notice. As we closed in on a target, disguised as an ordinary merchant vessel, we'd suddenly drop the false colours and run up the black flag. In that instant, the air itself seemed to freeze. Black on the sea meant one thing: we answer to no nation, no law, no court. We play by our own rules alone. And the designs on those flags weren't random. They were precision-targeted advertising. Skull and crossbones the classic. Translation: resist and you die. Skeleton holding an hourglass. Your time is almost up. Surrender now. Skeleton driving a spear through a bleeding heart that was Blackbeard's signature. It promised a death that was slow and deeply unpleasant, a red flag the most terrifying signal of all. Red meant no mercy, no exceptions. Even if you surrendered, we were coming for everyone. The whole strategy depended on building a reputation. If your name was feared enough, and your methods brutal enough, the crew of a merchant ship would see that flag and their legs would stop working. They'd think, is dying for the owner's cargo really worth it? The cargo is insured. My life isn't. So most of the time, when you watch the other ship's flag tremble and drop in surrender, that black flag had done more work than 100 cannons ever could, winning without a fight. That was the peak of the profession. But when the flag didn't work, when someone decided to be brave, well, the polite part of the evening was over. When the flag failed to break them, we moved on to the part of the job that was loud, chaotic, and absolutely not elegant. Understand something first. Pirates didn't fight to maximize casualties. We fought to disable, to take the ship, not sink it. The moment a target refused to yield, our captain, easygoing in peacetime, snapped into something cold and precise. He'd direct the helmsman to work for the T position, maneuvering our ship across the bow or stern of the enemy. That way, every gun on our broadside could fire freely, while they could barely return a shot. At the captain's signal, the world exploded. 15 cannons firing together, the vibration travelled straight up through your feet into your skull. Thick sulphur smoke blinded you and killed your hearing instantly. But we weren't just firing solid iron balls. Chain shot 2 small cannonballs linked by a chain, fired out spinning like a giant pair of scissors. It cut through masts, rigging, and sails. Left them dead in the water, a perfect target. Grape shot a canvas bag packed with small iron balls. One shot, and it scattered like an enormous shotgun blast designed to clear every living person off an enemy deck. Once their masts were down and their speed was gone, the final phase began. Boarding. Grappling hooks swung out and bit into their railing. The whole crew hauled on the ropes until both hulls ground together. Then the quartermaster's voice cut through the smoke. Board them! You and your brothers went over with a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other. Pure adrenaline. Real boarding combat was fast and chaotic. Your pistol fired once, then it was a club. Everything after that was steel. And most merchant sailors who signed up to move cargo and not to die took one look at these gunpowder-blackened, wild-eyed men charging over the rail and dropped their weapons. Smart choice. When the smoke settled, it was harvest time. But this wasn't a free-for-all. The first iron rule of pirates. All plunder belongs to the group. Pocket so much as 1 extra coin, and you're a traitor. The crew turned that merchant ship inside out. Not just gold, fine silks, sugar, tobacco, spare anchors, the ship's surgeon's medicine chest, nothing was left behind. Once the goods were converted to hard currency through the black market, the most sacred ritual began. The quartermaster stood before the entire crew, in full view of everyone. First, he paid the injured their compensation. Then, precisely according to the code, he poured every man's rightful share into his own hands. When you felt that weight heavy and real in your palm, you knew. Every bit of smoke, every moment of danger, every second of that boarding charge, it was worth it. You'd never held that much money in your life. In that moment, you were king of the sea, but the wealth was beautiful while it lasted. Because out there, on the edge of the horizon, an empire's shadow was quietly moving in. Brother, just as your pockets were full and you were headed to Nassau for a proper celebration, the wind shifted. Those empire superpowers, Britain, Spain, France, the ones too busy fighting each other to bother with us, they'd finally settled their wars, and now they had nothing to do but come after us. Their warships were idle. Their only remaining mission put every one of us on the gallows. The authorities came at us in 2 waves. First, the soft approach, the king's pardon. Surrender to the governor before the deadline. Whatever you stole, whoever you harmed, all officially forgiven. For older sailors who were tired, who had enough money saved and just wanted to go home and buy some land, this offer was almost impossible to refuse. The brotherhood started fracturing. Some surrendered, some smelled a trap. And some men, like Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most legendary names in the game, accepted the pardon, then turned right around and became pirate hunters, leading the authorities straight to the people they used to sail with. Then came the hard approach. The Royal Navy deployed actual frigates. not the clumsy merchant ships we were used to preying on. These were purpose-built killing machines faster than us, better armed, crewed by trained marines. The small islands that used to shelter us were now full of patrol ships. Governor Spotswood even funded a special mission out of his own pocket to hunt Blackbeard specifically. The world was closing in. The freedom we'd carried under that black flag was slipping through our fingers like sand. In the end, the outcomes were already written. The lucky ones took a cannonball in a final fight and went out quick. The unlucky ones were taken to Port Royal, tried in public, hanged on the dock, their cages left swinging in the harbour for months as a warning to everyone watching. The cruelest irony? That dream of retirement was always a fantasy. We spent faster than we earned. Most ended up dying alone on some forsaken island, or living under a fake name in a forgotten corner of some port city, pretending they'd never once sailed under a black flag. The golden age was over, but the strangest thing happened. The men disappeared, but the stories only grew. By all rights, this is where our story should end. A bit of a mess, a sad fade to nothing. The real golden age of piracy, as we've been telling it, lasted barely a decade. Most of the men from that era either ended up displayed on a harbour rope or quietly aged out in some alley with a royal pardon and an empty bottle. But something extraordinary happened. We may have vanished from the sea, but our second life was just beginning. This is history's most entertaining trick. It filters out the stinking bilge, the bug-infested biscuits, and the screams of amputation. All that's left is rum, freedom, and the open horizon. It started with a man named Captain Charles Johnson. In 1724, he published a book called A General History of the Pirates. This man was a genius of marketing. He mixed real accounts of Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and others with colourful embellishments and transformed outlaws into legends. Then in the 19th century, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island. And from that point on, everything we knew about pirates got completely reinvented. The treasure map pure Stevenson. Real pirates didn't bury their gold. Why would you? Spend it on rum now? Tomorrow might never come. Walking the plank, also literary invention. Real pirates who wanted to be rid of someone just threw them overboard. Much more efficient. The parrot on the shoulder that's all Long John Silver's doing. One fictional character and suddenly every pirate had a bird. Then Hollywood picked up the baton. From the swashbuckling grace of Errol Flynn to the global phenomenon of Captain Jack Sparrow, the pirate image was permanently stamped. Wild and free, quick and clever, a hero with a blade. We went from desperate men gambling their lives on the open ocean to the ultimate human fantasy of absolute freedom. Why does the world still love our story? Maybe because underneath every modern rule and obligation, every person carries a black flag somewhere inside them. Everyone secretly longs for the age when maps still had blank spaces on them, when sheer nerve was enough to rewrite your fate. The real us may have ruled the sea for only a handful of years, but the myth that grew in our wake has ruled the human imagination for 3 centuries. All right, friend, that's a wrap on our story, from the stench of the bilge all the way to legend. Thanks for riding this one out with me. Now, here's the second story of the night. What are the hidden truths of history? If you glance at your phone or calendar right now, it says 2026, right? But what if I told you that number is actually a lie? One that spans 1,000 years, woven together from ink, silence, and power. Would you think I'd lost my mind? Imagine waking up one day to discover you're living in a world that's been fast-forwarded. What if that stretch of history known as the Dark Ages, those 300 years with almost no major inventions, no grand architecture, barely a single meaningful war record, never actually happened? This is the theory that shook the world of historians. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. It argues that the years between 614 AD and 911 AD, nearly 3 centuries, were simply invented, fabricated. 300 blank pages spliced into the timeline of human history. By that logic, it's not 2026 right now. We may only be living in roughly 1725. You might laugh. Sounds like a pointless conspiracy theory, right? But think about it carefully. On the same continent that gave us Aristotle and Archimedes, how could an entire civilization suddenly go mentally dark for close to 1,000 years? Why are the European records from that period filled with vague legends and myths, while the astronomical records from the same era don't line up with the official dates at all. We were taught from childhood that after the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Europe plunged into a lightless dark age. But what if that darkness wasn't caused by a lack of light? What if someone deliberately pulled a thick blanket over all of humanity, covering up the truth and erasing the memory? The ones who first slapped the label Dark Ages onto that era were the very people who controlled the books, the knowledge, and the collective memory of the world, the early Christian church. The Vatican. When secular civilization collapsed, they became the only lighthouse left standing. But was the light they were casting meant to guide you, or to blind you? Ancient Greek and Roman libraries, schools, and research centers were burned or purged. Thousands of precious manuscripts quietly vanished. Only texts rewritten to serve church doctrine readable only by the priestly elite were allowed to survive. Everything you know about the past exists only because they allowed you to know it. So here's the real question. If these 300 years of blank history are real, who had the power and the motive to manipulate the flow of time itself? And why, in this supposedly ignorant age, were there people drawing maps centuries ahead of their time and holding knowledge that had no business existing? Don't jump to conclusions just yet. Tonight, we're going into that restricted archive, the one that doesn't open to the public. We're going to dig up the truths that were forbidden to teach. And when you realize this isn't just a history lesson, but a search for the life that was stolen from you, that's when the real fear begins. Have you ever noticed something strange when you look at world history maps? From those few centuries, there's an extraordinarily unsettling pattern. The Earth itself seems to have had a severe case of split-brain syndrome. On the very same timeline, China was living through the Sui and Tang dynasties, a genuine golden age. The great poets Li Bai and Du Fu were catching the moon's reflection in their wine cups. Woodblock printing was already launching knowledge into the air. The streets of Chang'an were packed with merchants from every corner of the world. Meanwhile, heading west, the Islamic world was equally lit up. Al-Khwarizmi was developing algebra. The libraries of Baghdad were stuffed with hundreds of thousands of ancient texts. The first public hospital had already opened its doors. But in Europe, at that exact same moment, the picture cuts to a grainy black and white silent film. The Roman Empire, the civilization that built the Colosseum and laid roads across an entire continent, somehow failed to leave behind a single decent brick for hundreds of years after its fall. No philosophical manuscripts, no new paintings, not even ordinary people's stories about their everyday lives. Cities like Milan and Cologne, once great metropolises, seem to have simply evaporated from the earth for 3 centuries. Not one trace of civilizational progress. That doesn't make sense, does it? Doesn't this look far more like collective amnesia than a natural decline? Why was the whole world plugged in while Europe alone had its power cut? When the East was studying stars and mathematics, the people of Western Europe were being told, you don't need to know anything except how to pray. This civilizational break wasn't organic decay. It looks far more like a deliberate, targeted shutdown, because in the chaos that was Europe at the time, the only group that still had the organizational capacity, the only ones who could still pick up a pen and write, were the church. Once secular schools and libraries were abandoned and absorbed, the Vatican became the sole memory card of European civilization. They didn't just monopolize the interpretation of history, they monopolized the power to decide which history was even worth remembering. If a period of history didn't fit their narrative, the cleanest solution wasn't to rewrite it. It was to make that time simply disappear. It's like someone stealing your phone and then telling you, those months never happened. Your feed was blank. The sky was dark the whole time. You were asleep. You might ask, didn't people object? Brother, when most people couldn't even write their own names, when the only source of knowledge was the priest at the pulpit, what were you going to question it with? You'd never seen the light. How would you even know you were living in the dark? But don't assume the truth was completely erased. If you look closely at those deliberately cold-shouldered centuries, you'll find things that couldn't be hidden. If Europe was asleep, then why did certain advanced technologies, the kind only ancient civilizations should have possessed, suddenly appear out of nowhere in this supposedly ignorant era? Next, we need to talk about the key that locked the human mind, a language engineered specifically to conceal the truth. Have you ever wondered if you wanted to completely imprison the soul of a civilization, what would be the most effective method? Not high walls. not soldiers. You destroy their language. Then you put a lock on knowledge that only you can open. Before the fall of Rome, classical Latin was the shared language of law, literature, and science. It was alive, it flowed, it belonged to every educated citizen. But as the Dark Ages descended, the Vatican did something deeply calculated. They didn't let Latin die. They castrated it. They took a rich, living language and converted it into a dense, narrow, deliberately obscure form of ecclesiastical Latin. No longer a tool for exchanging ideas, now a wall between people and truth. In this new version, the Church held absolute control over what every word meant. The narrow gate of knowledge, Pythagorean mathematics, Aristotelian philosophy. Cicero's political thought, everything that had once belonged to all of humanity, was translated into a form only the priestly class could decode. The theological filter, when monks copied ancient texts, they weren't transcribing word for word. Anything that contradicted church doctrine was reinterpreted or simply deleted. The power to define heresy, thousands of original manuscripts on natural science, medicine, and non-Christian philosophy were labelled irrelevant to the salvation of the soul, then locked away where no one could reach them. This created a reality that should genuinely terrify you. Knowledge was no longer a light illuminating humanity. It was a tool for controlling it. For those centuries, if you wanted to learn history, you had to go through a priest. If you wanted to read an ancient text, you needed permission first, and then you were taught the one and only correct way to interpret it. Imagine every library in the world, padlocked shut, and the key hanging around one person's neck while they tell you, "Anything I don't read to you is the devil's lies." The cruelest part is that this ecclesiastical Latin became the shackle locking humanity's collective memory. When classical Latin was lost, even if an ordinary person stumbled upon a manuscript left by their ancestors, all they saw was an incomprehensible wall of symbols. This artificially created cultural rupture made Europeans completely forget the brilliance they had once possessed. Independent verification disappeared. Debate was banned. History became doctrine, and doctrine cannot be challenged. So if knowledge was under lock and key, where exactly were those locked-away secrets kept? Those forbidden truths that could overturn an entire worldview? Is the Vatican Secret Archives really just a vault full of yellowed parchment? Or does it hold evidence of advanced knowledge that proves the Dark Ages were a fabrication from the start? This is the name that sends chills down the spines of scholars worldwide, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It's real, it exists, but to the outside world, it functions like a black hole. Light goes in, information doesn't come out. Beneath the ancient stone floors of the Vatican, in corridors the sun never reaches, sit over 50 miles of shelving and more than 1 million documents. Layered access restrictions and strict prohibitions keep it sealed. Without papal authorization, no one sees the full picture. Officially, it's described as private custody. To the rest of us, it looks more like a cold storage facility for suppressed human history. So what was considered so dangerous during those dark centuries that it had to be permanently buried? The lost Gospels. Stored here are original manuscripts excluded from the biblical canon texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. These documents describe a completely different worldview. Some record human civilizations that predate Adam. If ordinary people ever read these, the Church's entire one true truth script would collapse instantly. Maps that shouldn't exist. Less than 1% of the archive's ancient cartographic collection has ever been made public. Among those maps are some that accurately chart the coastline of Antarctica without ice. Before the age of exploration, who could have possessed that kind of God's eye view? These maps prove that humanity's understanding of the world was never truly interrupted. It was simply placed under forced quarantine, technology ahead of its time. Ancient manuscripts written in undeciphered scripts contain precise astronomical observations and anatomical diagrams that shouldn't exist yet. If this evidence leaked, everyone would understand. The Dark Ages wasn't humanity getting dumber. It was knowledge being deliberately hidden. Why does the Vatican guard these yellowed pages like they're live explosives? Because truth itself is the most destructive weapon. If evidence shows that Europeans already possessed advanced scientific and geographic knowledge during the so-called Dark Ages, The entire narrative of "the church brought the light of civilization" collapses like a row of dominoes. They weren't preserving this knowledge, they were neutralizing it through possession. As long as something is never read and never shared, it might as well have never existed. But the historical cover-up goes even deeper. If they could manipulate the past by locking up books, what's even more audacious is this: they may have manipulated time itself. By altering the calendar, they pulled centuries out of thin air. Locking up books blindfolded you. What came next essentially reprogrammed your internal clock. Have you ever considered, is a year really as immovable as the rising and setting of the sun? In an era where text was monopolized, whoever controlled the calendar controlled humanity's very sense of existence. Three figures move through the shadows of history, playing a 1,000-year game of temporal sleight of hand. Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, the brilliant monk Gerbert of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, and behind them both the Vatican. Why would they tamper with the timeline? Divine right required it. If an emperor wanted to declare his rule the fulfillment of divine prophecy, adjusting the timeline to make his coronation land on a sacred, prophesied year was the ultimate political performance. Papal legitimacy depended on it. The Church needed to demonstrate to the world that its authority was unbroken and continuous. If gaps appeared in the record, the simplest fix was to insert fabricated years and invented papal names, making the holy chain look flawless. The calendar as a governing tool. By advancing the Julian calendar and later the Gregorian calendar, the Vatican didn't just adjust the seasons. They used it as an opportunity to recalibrate humanity's collective memory. And this isn't speculation. When you examine the so-called Dark Ages closely, you find that certain kings, certain battles, certain administrative reforms seem like historical carbon copies of each other. Charlemagne in the 9th century, his campaigns, his reforms mirror Constantine the Great from the 4th century with uncanny precision. Is that a historical coincidence? Or did someone, to fill those fabricated centuries, simply run the old script again under a new name? The phantom time hypothesis makes a bold claim. The years from 614 AD to 911 AD may simply never have occurred. You might ask, you can change a date on paper, but can you fool the sun and moon? Brother, don't underestimate these masters of time. The Vatican commanded the world's finest astronomers. When the stars didn't align with the official dates, they had the authority to decide, was the sky wrong or was the record wrong? Those who control time don't need to argue with you about the truth. They just need to build an unquestionable mythology of power through systematic fiction. If human-written books can be burned and calendars can be falsified, what in this world is absolutely, inarguably real? The answer is right above your head, that sky. The cosmos left us the only original hard drive that no pen can ever alter. During those long centuries, called the Dark Ages, authorities could seal every library on Earth. But they couldn't put a stamp of censorship on the moon. Astronomy is the sharpest scalpel we have for cutting through 1,000 years of lies. The eclipse records that don't match. Modern scientists use precise computational models to backtrack ancient astronomical events. What they found is genuinely unsettling. Many solar eclipses recorded in European historical texts simply don't correspond to what actually happened in the sky's testimony. Eclipse records from Chinese, Jewish, and Arab civilizations frequently diverge from the European Dark Ages dates by decades, sometimes centuries. Either the stars went off course, or someone deliberately rewrote the timing of astronomical events to fit a manufactured religious chronology, the calibrated truth. Medieval European astronomers who refused to adjust their calculations to match the Church's official timeline were accused of practicing the devil's craft. The Vatican held the world's finest observational data, but it wasn't used to find the truth. It was used to manufacture it. Picture this: an astronomer dares to look up at the stars and discovers that the Church's most sacred historical events leave no trace whatsoever on the actual star map. Imagine the terror of that realization. Galileo, Bruno, you know those names. You probably think they were persecuted over a conflict between science and religion, but the deeper reason may be far darker. They touched the forbidden. They tried to use the universe's true clock to wake up a world sleeping inside falsified time. The Vatican shaped how the world understood darkness. by controlling the very light coming from the stars. Once humanity lost the ability to precisely locate itself in the river of time, memory became clay-shaped by whoever held the mold. So if time itself was doctored, was the science and technology of that era really as primitive as the history books claim? What comes next may shatter everything you thought you knew about that ignorant age. If I told you that buried in the soil of that era described as not even knowing what a compass was, engineers today would blush. At what archaeologists have found, would you start to think the entire curriculum was a lie? The script we were handed says, after Rome fell, humans suddenly forgot how to build, how to calculate, even how to bathe. But the truth, like those deliberately buried gears, has a way of surfacing at exactly the wrong moment for those who buried it. Bronze gears out of time. In German soil, archaeologists unearthed bronze gear mechanisms of extraordinary craftsmanship dated precisely to that backward era. These required advanced mathematics and sophisticated metalworking. Who was quietly engineering precision instruments while everyone else was supposedly rolling in the mud? Cosmic observatories in monasteries. In abandoned monasteries and underground facilities, people have found astronomical instruments of startling accuracy. Official history says people of that time believed the Earth was flat. So who were these precision star tracking devices built for? Geothermal systems that shouldn't be there. In remote rural areas, traces of geothermal heating infrastructure have been discovered in regions with zero connection to Roman civilization. In an era supposedly defined by superstition and ignorance, who understood advanced principles of energy and thermal engineering? Faced with these discoveries, ones capable of shattering any worldview, the Vatican, self-appointed guardian of knowledge, responded with their most practiced move: dead silence. In Europe, most archaeological excavations, especially those in or near church territory, require Vatican approval. Countless significant artifacts, after being carefully preserved, simply cease to exist. Archaeologists bold enough to raise questions typically found their funding cut, their reputations buried, and their names erased from academia. Why are they so afraid of this advanced technology? Because a Europe that could create and innovate was the single greatest threat to theocratic rule. Only by convincing you that you were an ignorant nobody could they maintain their position as the sole holders of truth and sleep soundly while controlling your mind. These buried artifacts are screaming without a voice. We never got dumber. Someone just turned the lights off on us, and those who dared strike a flame in the dark who tried to reach the truth weren't given medals. They were given the Inquisition's iron cage and a bonfire. Brother, have you noticed? In that so-called Dark Age, the most dangerous crime wasn't murder or arson. It was asking questions. If your curiosity crossed the line, if you dared to look up at the night sky and speak the truth out loud, what met you wasn't a science award. It was the cold iron cage of the Inquisition and a fire burning red-hot beneath your feet. This wasn't just a war of faith. This was a systematic purge of the human mind. The Vatican, as the era's sole authorized outlet for truth, didn't need to prove they were right. They just needed to eliminate everyone who could prove them wrong. The thought grinder. The Inquisition was history's most efficient machine for suppressing dissent. It didn't just punish individuals, it punished ideas. If you proposed a theory that contradicted doctrine, no matter how correct it was, you faced a secret tribunal. No evidence required. An accusation was enough. Bruno's fire. In 1600, the philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned alive in the Campo de Fiori in Rome. His crime wasn't rebellion. It was arguing that the universe has no center, that countless suns exist. The Vatican could not tolerate a truth that struck at the root of divine authority, so they chose to extinguish it along with the person carrying it before it could spread. Galileo's lifetime of silence. Even a giant like Galileo, after seeing the truth written in the stars, was forced to kneel before the Inquisition and recant. He survived, but he spent the rest of his life under house arrest, hidden in shadow. It was a message to everyone. Dare to wake up and you will pay for it. The erased inheritance. Thousands of scholars who dared to translate ancient texts, study medicine, or pursue astronomy along with the life's work they had spent decades producing turned to ash in minutes. The long silence that followed made later generations assume that wisdom had simply never existed in that age. This terror achieved something elegant. People stopped thinking not from stupidity, but from fear. When asking questions was equivalent to signing your own death warrant, silence became a survival instinct. Over time, an entire continent fell into a deep intellectual coma. That is why that stretch of history looks so dark, because everyone who tried to light a fire was killed. The Vatican maintained a consistent historical narrative through the physical elimination of anyone who threatened it. But this mental conditioning didn't only target scholars, it reached every child's desk. So how did these carefully curated stories through textbooks and films complete their collective hypnosis of the entire human race? Have you ever noticed this? Even if you've never opened a single book about the Middle Ages, the moment I say Dark Ages, your mind immediately fills with images. A sky that's always overcast and grey, muddy streets, farmers in rags with hollow eyes, a looming church casting its shadow over everything. Where does that uniform visual memory come from? Is it really just historical truth? Or are we all living inside a 2-century-long collective hypnosis? First, let's talk about those standard textbooks printed on the desks of millions of children. You might assume the Dark Ages is an ancient term. It isn't. It was coined by 19th century scholars deliberately to glorify their own Enlightenment era. To make themselves look bright and modern, they first needed to paint the past pitch black. They needed to build it into a nightmare of superstition, ignorance, and total stagnation. The trimming of official memory. 19th century education established a clean, suspiciously tidy historical line. Greece, Rome, Dark Ages, Renaissance. Easy to remember. Conveniently ignoring the quiet advancements in mathematics, medicine, and architecture happening throughout the medieval period. K. Vatican complicity. When history was painted this negatively, the Vatican said nothing. Because, by controlling knowledge, they had already left behind a fractured legacy, and this darkness narrative actually reinforced their image as the one lone light in a world of ignorance. Strategic ignorance. Children were never taught to ask why centuries of historical records vanished collectively. No one told them what might be locked inside the Vatican's archives. Then, in the 20th century, mass media and Hollywood picked up the torch. Film became humanity's unofficial historian, turning cold textbook concepts into emotional truths you couldn't bring yourself to doubt. Lies defined by visuals. From The Name of the Rose to countless medieval films that grey, filthy, torture-drenched imagery cycles endlessly. Once you've seen it with your own eyes through a screen, you stop asking whether it's real. The death of curiosity. Once you've accepted the Middle Ages equals an ignorant black hole as default reality, any discovery of advanced technology from that era gets automatically filed under conspiracy theory. Truth dying in the spotlight. And right there, inside all that gripping drama and heavy visual filter, the real Europe, the one that progressed, that created, that was erased by those in power, dies completely in the public consciousness. This 100-year collaboration between education and media completed a perfect closed loop. It kept you from seeing. Then it taught you to dismiss. Then it made you forget you ever had the light. So do you still trust 100% of the historical images living in your memory? By now, you might feel like your entire understanding of the world has caved in. If time is fake, knowledge is locked away, and our collective memory was pre-assembled by Hollywood and textbooks, what can we actually believe? Are we just meant to live as unwitting extras in this carefully scripted Truman Show of history? The answer is no. The truth is buried deep, but it hasn't disappeared. It's been waiting for the people brave enough to ask the right questions to come and find it. Remember this. History should not be a marked racetrack you follow blindly. It's more like a maze. The Vatican may hold the map. They may have sealed many of the exits by controlling the calendar and locking away knowledge. But they miscalculated one thing, the human instinct to hunger for truth. Stay radically skeptical. When everyone tells you it was a dark age, ask, who turned the lights off? When the textbook calls it an intellectual wasteland, go looking for evidence of that technology that had no business being there. Read the testimony of the stars. People lie, paper decays, but the orbital path of a celestial body cannot be erased. Modern algorithms are precisely recalibrating the past, and those fabricated years, those tampered dates, have nowhere to hide in front of the universe's clock. Follow the silenced voices. Study the works placed on the index of forbidden books. Pay attention to the scholars who are forced to disappear for touching the forbidden. Every word of resistance they left behind is a signpost pointing toward truth. We live in 2026, or, if the phantom time hypothesis is right, perhaps 1725. Either way, it's a miracle we're here at all. The Vatican's 50 miles of secret shelving still stands. The shadow of power still falls over the right to interpret history. But the internet and modern technology have handed each of us a small chisel. Every time you question a standard answer, every time you explore a forbidden idea, you're chipping another small hole in the wall that seals the truth. When enough holes appear, the light finds its way through. The so-called Dark Ages were nothing more than a long nightmare human civilization forcibly put on pause. It's time to wake up. History doesn't ask you to believe it blindly. It asks you to examine it with your mind fully engaged. You've followed me all the way to the edge of the maze. Now push open that door and step into the real world, the brilliant, hidden world that's been waiting for you all along. Now, here's the third story of the night. Who really built the pyramids? When you hear the Great Pyramid of Giza, the first name that comes to mind is probably Pharaoh Khufu. We've been told since childhood that around 2550 BC, this pharaoh mobilized tens of thousands of workers and spent 20 years building the most magnificent tomb in human history. But what if I told you that story is riddled with holes and might be an academic deception that's held up for over 100 years? Would you think I'd gone crazy? Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's look at the evidence first. The ancient Egyptians were absolute record-keeping fanatics. They inscribed everything in hieroglyphics: how many donkeys the neighbour owned, how much grain was collected in taxes. Yet somehow, the greatest and most extraordinary structure in all of ancient Egypt, the Great Pyramid, has a completely blank interior. Not a single word about the construction process. No inscription praising Khufu's greatness. Not even a decent signpost. And here's what really kills the official story. If this was truly Khufu's tomb, where is he? The Great Pyramid has been searched from top to bottom. No royal mummy, no gold or treasures, no burial art or decoration of any kind. The so-called King's Chamber contains nothing but an empty granite box without even a lid. Have you ever heard of someone building themselves a magnificent palace? They're not furnishing it, not putting a coffin inside, and still holding a grand opening. Mainstream Egyptologists insist it's a tomb. But based on what? Just because, after centuries of exploration, someone found some faint, graffiti-like markings of Khufu's name tucked in an obscure crack. Does a Kilroy was here style inscription really support thousands of years of historical consensus? If you look at this without any preconceptions, the Great Pyramid looks far more like a massive, precision-engineered device of unknown purpose, not a grave. So the contradiction is sitting right on the table. Did Khufu actually build it? And if this isn't a tomb at all, what was the purpose of stacking 2.3 million giant stone blocks into the sky? Hold on. Once we set aside the tomb assumption and look at the engineering details, the ones that even modern machinery would struggle with, you'll realize that the story of primitive workers with ropes and copper, chisels pulling off a miracle, is an insult to anyone's intelligence. If the empty tomb was just a logical inconsistency, what we're about to discuss is the kind of hard physical evidence that would make the world's top engineers collectively hang their heads. Picture this. You're a labourer in 2500 BC. In your hand, a crude copper chisel, a rope, and some wooden rollers. Your boss, the pharaoh, points at an 80-ton block of granite as heavy as a tank and says, "Cut that into a perfectly flat surface. Drill a cylindrical hole through the centre. Tolerance, no more than 0.1 millimetre. You'd think he'd lost his mind. Why? Because granite is one of the hardest rocks on Earth, and in that era, the ancient Egyptians didn't even have iron tools. Can a copper chisel cut through a tank? Toy. Perbrommed. Mainstream historians have always told us the pyramids were carved out by masses of workers using copper instruments. But modern researchers actually ran the experiment. They took copper chisels reproduced exactly from ancient methods and attacked granite. The results? The tools failed almost immediately. Copper is too soft. Striking granite with a copper chisel is like trying to cut a steel plate with a plastic knife. Days of work yielded almost no progress at all, and the precision? Utterly impossible. No matter how many thousands of chisels you wore down, you could never produce the microscopic accuracy found inside the pyramid. Engineer Christopher Dunn studied the granite surfaces inside the Great Pyramid in detail. What he found was deeply unsettling. The drill holes left behind show perfect cylindrical core marks with a spiral cutting pattern, indicating that whatever tool made them penetrated deeper per revolution than a modern industrial diamond-tipped drill bit. The pyramid's alignment with true north has an error margin of less than 0.05 degrees. Even today, architects with laser theodolites and GPS can't guarantee that precision every time, and in those deep, dark internal passages where workers would have needed light, there is not a single trace of soot anywhere on any ceiling, not one smear of smoke. That implies a light source that produced no carbon residue whatsoever, something we still don't fully understand. Then there's the transport problem. Some of the granite blocks inside weigh 80 tons. Their quarry is 500 kilometers away. In an era with no wheels, no cranes, no heavy vehicles, how did these blocks get moved and then precisely stacked over 100 meters in the air? Mainstream history still has no answer that satisfies a single working engineer. All of this physical evidence points to one uncomfortable conclusion. Whoever built this originally possessed knowledge and technology far more advanced than the official story admits. This wasn't primitive craftsmanship. This was something closer to ancient precision industry. Since the copper chisel and rope script has completely fallen apart, let's shift our eyes from the pyramid itself to the mysterious figure sitting right beside it, because the damage on that monument pushes the construction date back by a full 7,000 years. If the pyramid's engineering made you question everything, the Sphinx next door uses hard physical evidence to rewind human civilization's timeline by 7,000 years. For a long time, mainstream Egyptology told us the Sphinx was built by Pharaoh Khufu around 2500 BC. But geologist Robert Schoch and independent researcher John Anthony West found something on the statue that had no business being there: deep water erosion. A rainstorm in the Sahara? That's right. West discovered that the vertical grooves carved into the Sphinx's body and enclosure walls were not the result of wind and sand. They were caused by long, intense periods of rainfall and flowing water. This raises a deadly logical question. The Giza Plateau today is a dry desert. The last time this region received enough rainfall to cause that level of water erosion was approximately 12,000 years ago. Back then, Giza wasn't a desert. It was fertile grassland. That means the Sphinx was likely carved more than 7,000 years before Khufu was even born, placing its origins at the end of the last ice age. The geological evidence suggests that, before Egyptian civilization as we know it appeared, a technologically sophisticated lost civilization may have already been here. West argues that early sculptors carved the great figure from natural rock, and that thousands of years later, pharaohs like Khufu simply excavated and restored the ancient monument and may have recarved the face in their own image. Khufu didn't build the Sphinx. He was merely its renovation contractor. Faced with this solid geological evidence, mainstream Egyptologists responded in a revealing way. They couldn't argue against the meteorological data or the erosion models, so they did the next best thing: ignored it. The geology has been confirmed. The Egyptologists simply refused to adjust the timeline because doing so would collapse the academic foundation they'd spent a century constructing. West once remarked that the establishment simply hopes this evidence will go away on its own. May. When scientific fact collides with academic doctrine, the truth often gets thrown in a locked room. And that confrontation reached its most absurd point in front of a tiny mysterious door deep inside the pyramid. In the narrow passages where even robots struggle to maneuver, what is it that the authorities are so afraid of? Finding, if the Sphinx's rainfall marks aren't dramatic enough, what happened inside the pyramid, a 30-year game of hide-and-seek, will make you wonder whether the official side is playing with fire. For a long time, mainstream experts insisted that the narrow shafts in the Queen's chamber were purely symbolic decorations leading nowhere. Then, in the early 1990s, German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot crawling into these passages only 20 centimeters wide and into the darkness. After traveling over 60 meters, the camera captured something that should have detonated the entire archaeology world. At the end of the passage, a mysterious stone door, finely polished and completely sealed. Even more bizarre, the door had 2 copper handles embedded in it. You have to understand, no metal components had ever been found anywhere inside the Great Pyramid before this moment. Those two copper handles were essentially screaming at the world. Something extremely important is behind this. Gantenbrink's team was ready to push forward and find out. Then Egyptian authorities issued an absolute order. No further investigation, period. Why? Stopping at this precise breakthrough moment triggered an immediate wave of public suspicion. Were they protecting the monument, or protecting themselves from a truth that, once revealed, couldn't be taken back? It wasn't until 2002, nearly a decade later, that National Geographic was allowed to conduct a new investigation. The world watched as a tiny drill bit opened a small hole in the stone door, and a fibre optic camera was inserted. The result? Behind the first door, less than 20 centimetres away, stood a second sealed stone door, also completely sealed. And despite over 20 years of requests from researchers worldwide, Egyptian authorities have refused to open it. Then, in 2017, modern technology delivered another blow. An international team of scientists performed muon tomography, essentially a full-body X-ray of the pyramid using cosmic rays. The results stunned scientists everywhere. Directly above the Grand Gallery, a massive hidden void was detected, at least 30 meters long. Its volume rivals the combined total of all known chambers inside the pyramid. It has no known entrance or connecting passage. Scientists called it one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in decades. Nobody knows if it's a structural element or something far more startling than Khufu himself. And again, every request to investigate further was blocked by Egyptian authorities, citing safety and preservation. A sealed chamber with inexplicable copper handles. A secret void the size of an aircraft hangar. The official, "it's just a tomb" story struggles harder with every new discovery. If there was truly nothing inside, why the fierce resistance to looking? Behind all of this resistance stands one man. He controls every secret beneath Egypt's surface, and who gets to ask questions, and who gets told to sit down. If Egyptology were a video game, Dr. Zahi Hawass would be the final boss, the one standing at the last checkpoint, who can yank your power cord at any moment. In Egypt, Hawass wasn't just an archaeologist. He was the Tsar of the nation's history. As Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, and later Minister of Antiquities, he held near absolute authority. In Egypt, who could dig, where they could dig, what they found, and whether the world got to know about it, all passed through one man's approval. His signature cowboy hat and passionate speeches made him a global media darling, the face of Egypt. But beneath that charismatic surface was an extremely rigid, borderline authoritarian system of control. His most controversial quality was his attitude toward alternative theories. If your research challenged Khufu built the pyramid, or the pyramid is a tomb, you weren't entering an academic discussion. You were being blacklisted. When independent researchers sought access to the pyramid's unknown spaces, Hawass made clear that certain doors were closed by him and would stay that way. Rudolf Gantenbrink, the engineer who found that mysterious door with copper handles, was barred from returning after his discovery. Robert Barvel's Orion Correlation Theory and Shox's scientific report on the Sphinx's water erosion were both aggressively marginalized. What was he actually protecting? The mainstream view says he was defending academic credibility and national pride. If you admit that the pyramid might predate known civilization, or was built with a more advanced ancient technology, every textbook needs rewriting, and the entire foundation of Egyptology collapses. And if the pyramid genuinely contains technology beyond its era, or evidence capable of rewriting human civilizational history, then whoever guards that door carries a burden that cannot be publicly named. His policies created an academic vacuum. Because he controlled the approval of every excavation, discoveries that could have rewritten history may have been pushed back into the sand the moment they surfaced. He made himself the ultimate filter of Egyptian history. Most of what's written in books about the pyramids is wrong. This line has been used to describe the monopoly Hawass held over Egyptological scholarship. But think about it carefully. When truth itself has to be cleared by one person before it's allowed to be truth, how much of the history we've read is actually real? Since Dr. Hawass worked so hard to keep those doors sealed, let's take a closer look at the alternative theories he so aggressively dismissed. What exactly did they get their hands on? If the stone door with copper handles already felt like a thriller, the 2017 scientific discovery blew an enormous hole straight through the pyramid's airtight official narrative. For years, traditional archaeology relied on drilling, probing, and digging, all of which cause irreversible damage to ancient sites. So an international team of scientists deployed cutting-edge muon tomography technology instead. Think of it as a non-invasive full-body scan using cosmic rays that penetrate hundreds of meters of solid rock. Where there's empty space, the ray density changes. The results made scientists' jaws drop worldwide. Directly above the Grand Gallery, the pyramid's famous main corridor, a massive unknown void was hidden, at least 30 meters long. Its volume matches the combined total of all known chambers inside the structure. It has no known entrance, no connecting passage, a sealed island, frozen in time. Scientists called it one of the most important archaeological findings in decades, but nobody knows whether it's a pressure relief structure or something containing secrets that would overshadow Khufu himself. Predictably, every proposal to investigate further was blocked by Egyptian authorities under the banner of safety and preservation. The logical contradiction is glaring. If there's truly nothing inside the pyramid, why is the response to a scientifically confirmed hidden space so evasive? If that void contains technology that shouldn't exist 4,500 years ago, or evidence that could rewrite the origins of human civilization, then the carefully constructed historical script burns down completely. This consistent pattern of obstruction at every critical juncture makes the physical evidence inside the pyramid feel even stranger. And since science has already confirmed there's far more inside than we know, let's look even further. Because those massive stones weren't just heavy. Their very arrangement seems to point toward a prehistoric era that mainstream history has forcibly erased. If the pyramid's internal structure left you confused, look up at the night sky and you'll find a truth even more staggering. The pyramids aren't just a wonder of the earth. They're a stellar clock pointing deep into the cosmos. For years, mainstream archaeology treated the pyramid layout as aesthetic or coincidental. Then independent researcher Robert Bauval proposed a theory capable of overturning every textbook. He called it the Orion Correlation Theory. Using computer simulation, Bauval discovered that the positions of the three Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau precisely mirror the three stars of Orion's belt. In ancient Egyptian culture, Orion was no ordinary constellation. It represented Osiris, god of the afterlife, rebirth, and eternal return. But here's the most disturbing detail. The alignment of the three pyramids doesn't correspond to 2500 BC Khufu's era. The date when that alignment achieves perfect mathematical precision is 10,500 BC. That's 8,000 years before mainstream history places the beginning of Egyptian civilization. To create this alignment, the builders would have needed extraordinarily precise astronomical knowledge, including the ability to calculate precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts star positions over thousands of years. This alignment looks like a deliberate timestamp, a message carved into the landscape, telling future generations exactly when this structure was truly born. Mainstream historians counter that the people of that era were primitive gatherers, completely incapable of this kind of astronomical mapping. But then, who did it? And beyond the coordinates, the stones themselves remain a mystery. Some of the granite blocks inside weigh 80 tons. Their quarry is 500 kilometers away. The wooden rollers and ropes explanation offered by mainstream historians sounds like a joke to modern engineers. Even today, moving, hoisting, and precisely placing an 80-ton stone block requires sophisticated planning and heavy industrial machinery. How did people thousands of years ago achieve what modern engineers would find extremely challenging with no wheels, no cranes, and no engines? Faced with astronomical evidence that could push civilization's origins back several thousand years, the mainstream archaeological world, especially Hawass, responded with fierce resistance. Acknowledging that the pyramids may predate known civilization means not only rewriting every history book, but touching the deeply sensitive nerve of national identity and pride. If we accept the Orion correlation evidence, we're forced to admit, before the pharaohs, there existed a highly advanced civilization, one that mastered some kind of lost technology. Who were they? And after they disappeared, what else did they leave behind? When we take our eyes off the Giza Plateau and look around the entire planet, a spine-chilling pattern emerges. In an era mainstream history designates as primitive society, strikingly similar megalithic constructions appeared simultaneously in locations around the world. This pattern led independent researcher Graham Hancock to propose a bold hypothesis. Before ancient Egypt, a global advanced civilization existed on Earth. This civilization disappeared after a catastrophic event or a long decline, but fragments of their knowledge scattered like seeds across every continent. In Turkey, far from Egypt, archaeologists discovered Göbekli Tepe, a magnificent temple complex dating back approximately 12,000 years. It proves that in the supposedly primitive hunter-gatherer era, humans already possessed the organizational capacity for large-scale engineering and precision sculpture. This not only supports the existence of a lost civilization, but also reinforces the possibility that the Sphinx is truly ancient. The same precision engineering appears elsewhere. The Osirian at Abydos built from massive granite blocks, matching the Great Pyramid's accuracy and construction style, far beyond anything early Egyptians should have been capable of. The stone sarcophagi at the Serapeum of Saqqara, machined to a precision that would challenge modern equipment, let alone Bronze Age tools. Researchers like John Anthony West and Robert Schoch observed that ancient Egyptian civilization appeared to have reached its architectural, astronomical, and mathematical peak almost overnight with no visible evolutionary build-up from primitive origins. The only logical explanation? The Egyptians weren't the creators of this knowledge. They were its inheritors. They excavated and restored what earlier hands had built, absorbed what remained of that lost civilization's technology, and wrapped it all inside their own mythology. Whether it's Puma Punku in South America, Easter Island in the Pacific, or Giza in Egypt, these ancient sites all share the same fatal paradox. How were multi-ton stone blocks moved and precisely positioned without heavy machinery? Mainstream historians have never produced a convincing answer. And this engineering gap, spanning the entire globe, quietly suggests that some advanced ancient technical knowledge once circulated worldwide knowledge we haven't fully recognized yet. Despite the mounting evidence pointing toward an older, far more advanced civilization, the mainstream archaeological world continues to call it impossible. Why such fierce resistance? Because acknowledging that the pyramids and the Sphinx originated from an earlier lost civilization means tearing down the entire existing framework of human history and starting over. And in this battle over the right to interpret the past, some are protecting academic prestige while others are protecting a nation's sense of identity. What vested interests lie behind this collective resistance? And how much of the truth we've been handed since childhood has been filtered to protect someone's dignity? Brother, by now you're probably carrying one enormous question. If the evidence has piled up to the point where it's nearly bursting through the official narrative, why does the mainstream archaeology establishment still stand there like an iron wall, refusing to budge? Can these top scholars really not see those precision drill holes, or the 10,000-year-old water erosion on the Sphinx? The truth usually isn't in the science lab. It's in the human forces outside the lab: reputation, pride, and the backbone of a nation. For most mainstream historians and archaeologists, admitting to a more ancient and more advanced civilization isn't as simple as revising a few sentences. The entire academic structure collapses. Their professorships, decades of published papers, best-selling books, the prestige they've accumulated across entire careers, all of it is built on the traditional timeline where Khufu built the pyramid. Admitting error means museums relabeling their displays, textbooks going into the bonfire, and the foundation of an entire discipline being torn up. To them, conceding that an outsider like John Anthony West was right would be harder than admitting they were aliens themselves. In Egypt, the pyramid isn't just stone, it's the icon of a nation's soul. If you tell modern Egyptians that their most celebrated wonder was actually left behind by an unidentified prehistoric civilization thousands of years earlier, and that their ancestors merely stumbled upon it and did some renovations, that's almost impossible to accept emotionally. This protective instinct sometimes evolves into an irrational defense, where any discussion of a lost civilization automatically gets labeled pseudoscience or conspiracy theory. And we can't ignore the economics. Egypt's tourism industry supports millions of livelihoods, and Khufu and the Great Pyramid is the most valuable ticket in the world. Tourists want a clean, certain story. Which pharaoh, which year, how many workers? If official guides started saying, We actually don't know who built this, or what it was for. That uncertainty would undermine the monument's sacred mystique. This is why managers like Hawass had to ensure the official narrative stayed absolutely stable. Every sealed chamber, every halted investigation was in a sense maintaining the value of the brand. Perhaps mainstream archaeology genuinely is protecting the heritage from irresponsible sensationalism. But in doing so, is this excessive caution unintentionally burying humanity's most important truths alongside the sand? By refusing to investigate the massive void detected by muon scanning, or by keeping that door with copper handles permanently sealed, they may have preserved short-term academic dignity, while leaving the entire human civilization stuck at the starting line of its own origin story for decades. We're approaching the end of the mystery, when all the vested interests, the reputations, and the national pride step aside. What is that solitary giant stone structure standing alone in the desert trying to tell us? Standing on the golden sand of the Giza Plateau, looking back across this 10,000-year journey of discovery, you realize that the Great Pyramid is not just a pile of stones. It's a letter sent across time to all of humanity. It indicts mediocrity. It indicts lies. And it indicts our own arrogance, our stubborn assumption that we know better than the people who came before us. We have to face an uncomfortable truth. The official history we absorbed as children may be only the tip of the iceberg or a carefully trimmed bonsai, shaped by people who needed the story to look a certain way. There is no clear inscription proving Khufu was the builder. That silence alone is deafening. The precision drill holes and flawless cut surfaces things modern machinery would struggle to replicate are quietly mocking the copper chisel fairy tale. The 10,000-year water erosion on the Sphinx cuts straight through the Pharaoh's exclusive claim to the story, and even as gatekeepers like Hawass have worked to maintain the status quo ceiling, investigation, halting robot probes, science cannot be locked away forever. The 2017 muon scan proved that inside a structure studied for centuries, entirely unknown spaces still exist. Behind those two sealed stone doors with copper handles, there may be a technical blueprint from a lost civilization, or the final piece of the puzzle of human origins. If those sealed doors are ever opened, and the evidence conclusively shows the pyramids were built by a far older, far more advanced lost civilization, what happens to the world? Historians will have to accept that civilization doesn't move in a straight line upward. It may have reached breathtaking heights before and fallen. Egyptians and all of humanity will reconsider their own identity, realizing we are not solitary survivors who crawled out of ignorance, but the inheritors of a magnificent legacy. The pyramids have stood for 5,000 years, not to give tourists a photo opportunity. They've been waiting for the people willing to challenge doctrine, willing to look directly into the shadow. History's greatest secret was never lost. It's been sitting right in front of you, just buried under layers of authority by people who needed you not to ask questions. The key to what comes next isn't in Hawass's hands. It's in yours, in everyone who stays curious and refuses to be blindly fed a story. When the last ray of sunlight falls across the tip of the pyramid, we know that great structure is still silent. But its silence isn't because it has nothing to say. It's waiting for us to become wise enough and brave enough to hear what it left for the future. The truth may be more astonishing and more significant than anything you've imagined. Good night.